Baruch
Baruch
Adonai
Eloheinu melech haolam asher
shanu
b'mitzvotav
V'tzivanu
lasot divrei Torah.
Praise to you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who's made us holy with your commandments and commanded us to busy ourselves with the words of Torah. And we will indeed get some literal Torah quotes going for us to study, but first we're going to have a little bit of humor. There is a story that one of the rabbis in the Talmud would always start his classes with humor because it put everybody in a better mood for learning. So you can take these jokes with you to the Seder. First question, what do you call a person who derives pleasure from eating the bread of affliction? Answer, matzah.
Oh, God.
All right. Second, why did the matzah quit its job? Answer, because it didn't get a raise.
That's bad.
And the third one, what's the best cheese for matzah pizza? I'll let you think about this one. Tell me when you think, and call the answer when you think you have it.
That's a pizza.
Mozzarella.
Bingo, mozzarella.
Good job, man. Wow.
What's the best cheese? Mozzarella.
That's clever. Good.
None of these are mine originally, but I did enjoy them and thought I would share them with you.
Yeah.
All right. So, the Afikomen on one foot. The Afikomen is a piece of matzah that we find and eat before midnight at the Passover Seder. There are three strands to the story of the Afikomen, one having to do with hiding it, one having to do with eating it, and one having to do with word Afikomen. These strands eventually converge in the Middle Ages, and the following sources are arranged by source and relate to the different strands. So as we go through different texts, keep in mind that they aren't going to seem to form a coherent narrative at the beginning, but they're either going to have to do with hiding the Afikomen, eating the Afikomen, or the word Afikomen. And we will stop and recap every so often. All right, our first text comes from Exodus. After the Pharaoh expelled the Israelites from Egypt following the 10th plague. And the text is, so the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls wrapped in their cloaks upon their shoulders. So my question is, what does this have to do with the Afikomen?
Well, if it was wrapped in their cloaks, it must have something to do with hiding it.
I thought, Karen.
Isn't it also, if you, as we know from the Seder, if you eat it before, if it's also an end point, the people, human beings remember often what's first and what's last. So if the Afikomen is last, it's in emphasizing the importance that it's unleavened.
All right, so you're tying that back into the fact that that the dough wasn't leavened, and because we have the Afikomen at the end, it makes it more memorable that we're eating unleavened bread.
Yes, and I'm also doing since we're rabbinic Jews, we're not biblical Jews, we know how the story comes out, we do it in circles, and we know what the rabbis are having us do and what we do at Seders.
All right, so these are good answers. There's also the fact that we are wrapping the dough, that the dough was leavened, or the kneading bowls were wrapped, and we wrapped the Afikomen. All right. Next text is from Exodus again, in the part where God is telling Moses what's going to happen for the 10th plague. And Moses said, "Thus says the Lord, about midnight I will go forth amongst the Egyptians." So, my question, what time will the 10th plague happen, according to this text?
Around midnight.
Around midnight. All right, very good. I promise we're going somewhere with this. Just play along. All right. So, again from the book of Exodus. This time when God is giving Moses further instructions about what the Israelites should do to prepare for the 10th plague. For on that night, I will go through the land of Egypt and strike down every male firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human and beast. And I will mete out punishments to all the gods of Egypt, I, God. All right, so based off the previous text, when it says, for on that night, I will go through the land of Egypt, what time does on that night refer to?
Well, you just set it up for midnight,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
the way you selected the text.
correct.
So just after midnight.
Around
Around midnight. Yes.
At midnight.
All right. Next text. So again, from the biblical book of Exodus, same set of instructions about how the Israelites should prepare for the 10th plague. And when it says the flesh that we're going to see, it means the Passover lamb that was sacrificed. They shall eat the flesh on that night. They shall eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs. So we're going to interpret this text using a technique known as Gzeira Shava, which is basically textual chutes and ladders. And the way that this game works is if the phrase means one thing in one place, we can assume it means the same thing in another place. So we've already ascertained that on that night in the previous text referred to around midnight. So using the Gzeira Shava chutes and ladders approach, what time or by what time does the Passover sacrifice need to be eaten?
Midnight.
Midnight. Yeah.
Midnight. All right,
Midnight.
good.
Oh, that's a Seder. The Seder is supposed to be done by midnight.
But why can't they be eating while he's passing over? And what do you mean by night? Are you saying after midnight it's day? Or are you just saying when there's an absence of sunlight? When do you transition from night to day or to morning? Sundown, sunrise?
Sunrise. So the pshat, the literal meaning of this text, would be that the lamb needs to be eaten sometime during the night. Because it says they shall eat the flesh of the lamb on that night. However, if you play this, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C sort of game, then if you say that on that night refers to around midnight in one spot, you could theoretically take the next leap of logic and say, therefore, it also applies in this case when we use the same phrase, quote, on that night.
Okay.
So that's what's going on here. This verse, by the way, is one of the key verses for Passover in general, because it's the source verse for a number of things, such as the Passover sacrifice had to be roasted, which was one of the original 4 questions. This is the verse, or the source verse for 3 of the original 4 questions about matzah, about maror, and about the roasted meat question, which was one of the original ones. This is a source for the Hillel sandwich with matzah and maror, except then we have charoset instead of the lamb. And finally, in the Maggid section, Rabban Gamliel says that if you haven't mentioned 3 things, then it doesn't matter how long your Seder goes. you missed something really important. And his three things are mentioning the lamb, or the Passover sacrifice, the matzah, and the maror. And that comes out of this verse that we're looking at right now. So this is a key verse.
I have
All
a
right. You have a question?
Yeah, just you mentioned the lamb really quickly.
Yeah.
Since we don't have a Pesach Korban or like a lamb sacrifice anymore,
Mhm.
does something else substitute our obligation to bring it?
Prayers.
Is it like the whole Seder itself that would fulfill that?
So
or is it-
the Seder, partly it's the Seder and partly the sacrifices are replaced with prayers in general. So
Okay.
Passover morning services would be the replacement for the Passover sacrifice.
And would the Mariv service count for the evening sacrifice?
Yes,
Oh, okay. I see. Thank you.
you're welcome. Good question. All right. So again, from the instructions to the Israelites before the 10th plague, we get this text. When your children ask you, what do you mean by this rite? You shall say, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when smiting the Egyptians, but saved our houses. And then those assembled bowed low in homage. So, if your child doesn't ask you, what do you mean by this rite? Then how could you prompt them to ask, given that you're supposed to give them this answer some way or another?
By bribing them with some candy.
That's a good response. There is a story of a Jewish educator who every year at his Seder full of children, he would say, the Seder is very important and it's very serious and we cannot be interrupted with any questions. So if you ask questions, I will be forced to throw candy at you. And then the children, of course, ask lots of questions.
David, isn't that what you do with the kids at junior congregation? You've gotten them hooked into coming because you do reward them with Hershey bars?
Oh yes, I mean that predates me, but yes, I did not get rid of that.
Oh, no, that's good. Yeah.
There's a Hershey bar for every family that they split up amongst all the children. If they come to junior congregation on a given month.
Right.
So David, the lamb is the paschal sacrifice.
Yes.
Sacrifice generally means we are sacrificing something to God.
Yes.
But we're eating this animal. So what is God getting from this animal in terms of a sacrifice that we can call the sacrifice?
The smell of the barbecue.
Yeah.
The sacrifices in general, the way they all worked was that, as it says, Reich nichoach l'Adonai, God gets the pleasing smell, and the priests and the people who bring the sacrifice get dinner.
And so we're not even sacrificing the entrails. We're not burning the entrails on the altar either.
Yeah, we might be. I'm a little shaky on that, but I will investigate.
David,
Yes,
can I offer an oral comment on that?
sure.
I read Rashi commentary, and Rashi comments to me that God does not use his sense of smell for us. Necessarily what God is saying by a sweet savor is that it's the sweet savor of our obedience to follow his commands and to follow his ways. And by doing the commands that we do, we are giving God a sweet savor.
Very nice. All right, thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
That answers the question of if God doesn't have a nose, why does God need a smell? And how is this relevant to us when we don't have the temple anymore?
Mhm.
All right, let's move on to the Mishnah. Okay, so in the Mishnah, Masechet Psachim, which is about Pesach, as you might guess, We have chapter 10, which is all about the Seder. And in chapter 10, we get a startling text that one does not conclude after the Paschal Lamb with an Afikomen. So, according to the Mishnah, no Afikomen for us. Yet, we still have the Afikomen. So how we get from this Mishnaic text to where we are today is something we have to figure out in the next half hour. And this text comes up in the Haggadah as the answer given to the wise child in the 4 children. All right, I've already given you the answer about whether or not the Mishnah thinks we should have an Afikomen. So let's go on. Also, in the same chapter of the Mishnah, the sages say that the Paschal Lamb after midnight renders one's hands ritually impure. That's basically what this is saying. And ritually impure basically means it's not okay. So, by what time must the Passover sacrifice be eaten according to the Mishnah?
After midnight?
Midnight.
No,
Yeah, by
before.
midnight.
The other thing is, David, can we eat the Afikomen before we eat the lamb? If we can't eat it after.
If the temple is standing and we have a Passover sacrifice, then the lamb gets the last spot. If the temple is not standing and we do not have a Passover sacrifice, then the lamb is no longer there to occupy the last spot, and that spot goes to the matzah.
But if the temple is standing and we sacrifice the lamb, what do we do with the Afikomen?
We eat it with the lamb, as it says in Exodus.
With the lamb. Okay.
In our time now, if for some reason somebody tries to eat the Afikomen after midnight,
Mhm.
is it impure, and does it render one's hands impure as well? Or does that
No,
only apply to the offering?
no, that only applies to the offering. If you eat the Afikomen after midnight, you are not Yotze, which means you have not checked that box. But on the other hand, given that it is still Passover, you are simply eating matzah on Passover as opposed to eating the Afikomen.
I've also, David, I've heard some say, some customs that since there is no temple standing, we cannot really do a sacrifice, and therefore lamb is forbidden at the Seder.
Correct. Lest anybody think that you are offering a sacrifice. That is true.
So we shouldn't eat lamb at the Seder at all anymore?
Generally considered a bad idea. The lambs will appreciate you leaving them alone for this holiday.
David,
Yes.
my father's line had a custom in their lit box that the lunch before one had lamb,
Yeah. All right.
which I think is also the last time technically one eats chame, whatever that meal is.
Yeah. Okay. This way you can have your lamb and have a lamb-free Seder as well.
David,
Yes.
I've wondered when we have talked in previous classes about concepts like midnight.
Uh-huh.
Was that a relative thing? Because they didn't have, an alarm clock that would go off. They didn't have a clock on the wall that, they would look at to say, oh, we're getting close to midnight. We better speed it up, or we got lots of time. We can slow it down. Kind of like as we do in the morning, many in the morning in the chapel. So, I mean, what was midnight? Did they have somebody blowing the shofar in the center of the city saying, oh, it's midnight, or?
That's a good question. So midnight in this context refers to halachic midnight. And the way that halachic midnight works is you take the time from when night starts, which is defined in the Talmud, in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, and you go until the time that morning starts, which is also defined, and then you divide that in half.
How do you measure the half?
You divide it in 12 to get a halachic hour, and then 6 halachic hours gets you to midnight.
Yeah.
Or noon, or midday.
You either measure time with a sundial and the sun wasn't out, or you had some sort of an hourglass with sand or a candle that was calibrated.
My God.
But
Yes.
Okay, so I
But
think
that
what we're
those
saying
things
is it was an
exist.
approximate.
but those things exist, and when we were slaves in Egypt, I
Well,
think
that might
maybe
be-
the sundial and maybe hourglass, like the candles, but everybody would have to have a calibrated candle or one of these hourglasses, and you'd have to. Oh, really?
So fortunately in the Torah, Moses says, or God says, I'll go around about midnight. So God had a little wiggle room. And Moses had a little wiggle room, and the Egyptians had a little wiggle room. And this way, God could be seen as being accurate.
All right. I suppose
by
you
the
can
time
observe the moon.
By the time of the Mishnah, now we're starting to get more specific, but fortunately we've also had 1,400 years for timekeeping devices to evolve.
Yes,
So
that's my point.
I will see what I can investigate about timekeeping 1,800 years ago and get back to you.
Probably astronomical observation.
Yes, that seems likely. All right. Let's move on to the Talmud, where we will be spending lots of time in Psachim, which is the section, the tractate of the Talmud about Passover.
Oh, thank you.
So, the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of Afikomen? Because in the Mishnah it says, no Afikomen, which might have made sense to them, but 300 years later, this term was no longer clear. So we get a few answers. Rav says, it means that a member of the group that ate the Paschal lamb together should not leave that group to join another group. One who joined one group for the Paschal lamb may not leave and take food with him. According to this interpretation, Afikoman is derived from the phrase Afiku mani, take out the vessels. The reason for this prohibition is that the people might remove the Paschal lamb to another location after they've begun to eat it elsewhere. This is prohibited as the Paschal lamb must be eaten in a single location by one group. Shmuel says, it means that one may not eat dessert after the meal, like mushrooms for me or chicks for Abba, which would be Rav.
Yeah.
It was customary for them to eat delicacies after the meal. Rav Chanina Bar Shela and Rabbi Yochanan say, Afikoman refers to foods such as dates, roasted grains, and nuts, which are eaten during the meal. It was taught in a Baraita, which is a text from the time of the Mishnah that didn't make it into the Mishnah, in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. One does not conclude by eating after the Paschal lamb foods such as dates, roasted grains, and nuts. All right, so to recap, when it says, what does don't have Afikomen mean? There are a few answers. 1, don't bring food from one Seder to another Seder after dinner. This connects, it was because it wasn't okay for groups eating the Passover sacrifice in the temple. They had to eat their food only with their dinner party. Alternatively, this connects to the Greek word epikomion, meaning a traveling dinner party, like a progressive dinner. So under this approach, the Passover meal should be a sacred meal, not merely an excuse for a good time.
David,
Right.
you said it has to be eaten by one group in one place. Does
Yes,
that mean two groups cannot sit down together at the same dinner table, like two families, and eat it together?
oh no, they can eat the same, they can be sharing it. In fact, the lamb was big enough that there was, and the rules were no leftovers. So therefore, you had to have people coming together to share the meal, share the lamb. It was your, like whether you had a party of 6 or a party of 16, You had to stay with your dinner reservation.
So if you sacrifice this large animal, could you give half of it to your neighbor at his house before you start eating?
No, your neighbor's supposed, in the time of the temple, your neighbor was supposed to be eating with you.
So the lamb's got to be kept together.
Yes.
Can't be separated.
Yes.
Thank you.
This does not apply to group orders of brisket from Grow and Behold today.
How about a chicken leg?
All right. Second possibility, that Afikomen refers to savory after dinner treats. Third possibility, Afikomen refers to sweet after dinner treats. And the fourth possibility is that Afikomen means orgies. None of this is permissible. All right. The text also says in the Talmud that you can have food, including sweet food, honey cakes and such, as long as you eat an olive bulk of matzah after consuming them. And at this point, I'm going to start speeding up because I want to make sure we get through this today. Another text from Psachim, if you, or that you're supposed to eat matzah after midnight. Sorry, if you eat matzah after midnight, you have not fulfilled your obligation. And this is because the same verse that talks about the Paschal lamb also talks about the matzah. So what's good for the lamb is good for the unleavened bread. Has to be eaten before midnight. Then we get earlier in Psachim that children should, in order to keep children engaged in the Seder, you should grab the matzah. And you should eat quickly so that they don't fall asleep before the Seder's done. Okay, so.
You cannot have an all-night Seder.
You can.
By midnight.
You can have an all-night Seder. You just have to finish your food by midnight.
So when can you pick up matzah again to eat it? After sunrise?
After sunrise.
Okay.
All right, so a recap so far from the Torah through the Mishnah and the Talmud. In our hide and seek strand, we see that when we left Egypt, we're told in the Torah that when our children ask us about the Passover ritual, we should tell them that God took us out of Egypt. In the Mishnah, they say, well, what if your child doesn't ask you? How do you fulfill this requirement? And their answer becomes the 4 questions. In the Talmud, they worry about how to provoke children to question on their own why Passover is different. And one of their answers is that if you take the matzah off the table, this will be different enough that it provokes a question. In our eating matzah strand, according to the Torah, Israelites were supposed to eat the Passover sacrifice together with matzah. Through textual interpretation, the rabbis in the Mishnah conclude that the Passover sacrifice has to be eaten by midnight. And the Talmudic rabbis say not only the sacrifice, but also the matzah must be done by midnight. In the Afikomen strand, the Mishnah says you shouldn't have any Afikomen after the Passover sacrifice. The rabbis of the Talmud want to know what this means. And they say either no progressive carousing parties, stick with your meal and treat this as an important occasion, or don't eat dessert, or you shouldn't eat a dessert after your Passover sacrifice because you want the taste of it to remain in your mouth. And once there is no temple and thus no Passover sacrifice, this approach goes to the matzah. That's where we are. I would take questions if we had more time, but we don't, so I'm just going to keep barreling ahead, and we can take questions at the end of the story. All right, Afikomen in the Middle Ages.
Crazy.
So now we get the Machzor Vitri, which was written in the 1100s by a student of Rashi. Rashi was an important commentator in the 1000s. So he says that this is the first time that we see the word Afikomen applied to matzah. So here we see that we are going to break the matzah, one of the matzot, and it's going to turn to the Afikomen. The Afikomen then gets put under the tablecloth. And at the end of our meal, we take the matzah out from under the tablecloth and we eat it as a reminder of the sacrifice in the temple. And after you do that, you need to stay put and you don't eat anything after the Afikomen. In case you wonder what you should do if you forget to eat the Afikomen before you do Birkat Hamazon, he addresses that here. If you're curious, you can read the source sheet later on. And then everybody gets some of the Afikomen to eat. So these are all Afikomen innovations that come from Rashi around the year 1100-ish. In the Mishnah Torah, which was written by Maimonides in the late 1100s. Rashi was in France, Maimonides was in Egypt, among other places. He tells us things that we already know. And then you have to eat an olive-sized piece of the matzah minimally. And if you only have one piece of matzah, then rather than do the motzi matzah step before dinner and skip the Afikomen, you should do the Afikomen part and say your motzi matzah blessings over that matzah at that point. And you should not only grab the matzah, but you should snatch the matzah from each other in order to keep the kids engaged, which leads us down our road of hiding the Afikomen.
Yay.
All right. In the Shulchan Aruch, which was not exactly where it was published, but it was in the Sephardic world in the 1500s. And this has become the definitive law code for anybody who's looking at Jewish law. This is a major text. So we see that the middle matzah is the one that gets broken in half, and the other half goes between the two ones, the half that's not getting hidden. We see, yes, Rabbi Yosef Karo. We see that you should recline while you're eating the Afikomen. We see that you do not make a blessing while eating the Afikomen because you're covered by your motzi, you're covered by your motzi blessing from before dinner. And you should eat the Afikomen before halachic midnight, which nobody had definitively stated until this point as refers to the Afikomen itself. All right. And I'm going to skip the recap because I basically just done that as we go along. Contemporary Afikomen customs. This brings us up to today. So the Afikomen is created when the middle matzah is broken in half at the Yachatz step of the Seder. The smaller half of the matzah is returned to between the other two pieces, the other two matzot. The larger half is wrapped up. Some people use a special Afikomen bag, but this is not required. Why the middle matzah? There aren't a lot of explanations about this one, but one that I found is that we all have aspects inside of us that have been broken. And we look forward to the day when we can be redeemed by becoming whole again, perhaps with the assistance of others. Additionally, why are we breaking the matzah pretty quickly into the Seder? Some point out that although the word Seder means order, breaking things early in the Seder and not on neat perforated lines means that there will always be some disorder that happens no matter how much we try to order our lives. The matzah, the Afikomen is wrapped, partly because it reminds us of the Israelites wrapping their dough or their dough bowls when they left Egypt, partly because it tells us what we've set aside so we don't get confused, partly to protect the Afikomen, and partly to collect crumbs during the hiding process. Some Ashkenazi children steal the Afikomen from the leader and hide it elsewhere, And then after the meal, the leader ransoms it back because you can't finish without the Afikomen. Sephardic Jews and many Ashkenazi Jews don't like the idea of teaching children to steal. So an adult will hide the Afikomen for children to find. This often happens during the hand washing rachza step or during the dinner step of Shulchan Aruch. It's often hidden by a leader, an adult family member, or an adult guest. Again, it is ransomed back once the children find it. If there are multiple children present, there may be decoy Afikomen, or the Afikomen may be broken into multiple pieces for each child to find one. As we've seen, this custom comes from the Middle Ages about having the Afikomen hidden. There's some symbolism here about the next generation being involved in bringing together that which was broken. The step of the Seder where the Afikomen is found is called Safun, which means hidden. It's related to the word Safon, meaning north, because in Israel, the north is hidden by the mountains of Lebanon. And there are those who have the custom of saying before eating, in memory of the Passover sacrifice that was eaten at the end of the meal. There are additional Sephardic and Mizrahi customs related to the Afikomen.
David, why
Yeah.
break the middle matzah and not take the whole matzah? Because if you take the whole matzah, you're breaking the pile of three. So why not just take the whole matzah and hide that?
Because the idea is that you bring it back together. When you return it back and you repair that which has been broken.
Well, wouldn't you bring it back by putting it back in the middle of the other two?
No, because you've eaten the other two for the matzah step and the korech step.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Yemenite Jews traditionally only have two pieces of matzah at the Seder. This is less expensive. And they break the lower one for the Afikomen. In many Sephardic communities, it is thought that the Afikomen has special sanctity. So Jews from Iran, Afghanistan, Salonika, Kurdistan, and Bukhara keep a piece in their pocket all year for good luck. In some places, pregnant women carry it with salt and then hold it in their hand during delivery. There is another belief that if you can keep a piece of the Afikomen for 7 years, then it can stop a flood if thrown into a turbulent river. Presumably, this has not been tested that often because it's hard to keep track of how many years you had a specific piece of matzah. Jews from Kurdistan and Jews in Hebron tie a piece of the Afikomen at the Seder to the arm of one of their sons and say, "So may you tie the ketubah to the arm of your bride." No pressure there. There's a custom which you may wish to consider for this year from the Jews of Baghdad, where somebody would leave the Seder with the Afikomen and return dressed as a traveler. The leader of the Seder would ask, "Where are you from?" And the person would answer, "Egypt." The leader would ask, "Where are you going?" And the person would respond, "Jerusalem." The leader would ask, "What are you carrying?" And the person would respond, "Matzah." So this idea of dressing up, of one person, at least one person dressing up, helps to get at the idea in the Seder of in every generation, a person should see themselves as if they have come out of Egypt. Other Sephardic communities do this with a child who then asks the 4 questions and then guards the Afikomen until after dinner. There's a Tunisian custom of giving the Afikomen to someone who then ties it on their shoulder, again, the dough bowls being carried on the shoulders, and goes to visit relatives and friends at their Seders to forecast the coming of the Messiah. And then there's another Sephardic custom similar to the previous one, but the Afikomen goes on everybody's shoulders, each person one at a time. And then they say the verse about carrying the dough on the shoulders. And then when the person asks, "Where are you going?" and the one is asked, "Where are you going?" and they respond to Jerusalem, then everybody shouts, "Next year in Jerusalem." And then we continue with the Seder. All right. Other uses of the Afikomen. In the book Kosher Soul, which came out this year by Michael Twitty, or last year, I guess. It's an excellent book, highly recommended. It's about his experiences as an African-American Jew who is a chef. I believe he's a James Beard Award winner. So he's written this this book about the pieces of his identity through food. And he gives the example of Rebecca Franklin, who is another Black Jew who has made a homemade matzah, or who makes a homemade matzah shaped like the continent of Africa called the Afikomen. The Afikomen is also a time traveling device in the book called Afikomen. It has no words in the book, but it takes these kids back to Egypt to witness Moses's journey down the Nile River, and then they help save Moses from various potential catastrophes. And after he's discovered by Pharaoh's daughter, then the Afikomen gets them back to their own Seder. Quickly showing you the appendices. We have a variety of songs and videos. This is La Matzah Rables, Matzah in the House, Dog versus Afikomen, Jake Gyllenhaal, not sure who that is, but I might be dating myself.
He's an actor. He's an
yeah.
actor.
He's an actor. All right, if you want to
A
see
really
him
good actor, yeah.
do something with the Afikomen, there's a video for you. It's on Shul and
That's
Sesame.
funny.
There's a musical called Afikomen the Musical. Rabbi Joe Black wrote the Afikomen Mambo, and Debbie Friedman made a song called I Am the Afikomen. If you want to see my bulletin article for the coming month, I have recapped this as a narrative in case it's easier to keep track of the story. And then finally, a variety of other people's thoughts about the Afikomen, Rabbi Stephen Wernick from the Conservative Judaism magazine, and a variety of thoughts after that as well. So
That's encyclopedic.
It's